In this video, I'm going to talk to you about a car that was superior to its competitors in every way, and yet ended up losing Audi 1.3 billion euros. The Mercedes A-Class was ugly, it had less room, it was cheaply built, and yet they sold 6 times as many. To me, this car is proof that human beings are absolute idiots. Let me tell you a little bit more about why this was so special and yet failed so spectacularly. For their first small car, Audi decided that a revolution was in order. They weren't just going to parrot what was already out there. They set their sights on a car that was going to be smaller than most super minis, while being roomier, more efficient, and yet built as well as the bigger Audis. For the chassis, they elected to use the aluminium space frame that Audi first debuted in '93 on the A8. This meant that they were able to make it very light, just 900 kilos. Also, it helps to fight corrosion. And yet, the quality and the switchgear was on par with other Audis. So unlike the Mercedes A-Class, which used interior materials sourced from a skip, this was pretty much the same as you would find in an Audi A4. Same quality of materials and same controls. Outside, it was shorter than a Fiesta, making it really easy to park, and yet it could fit 4 adults in comfort. Inside, it was roomier than the bigger Audi A3, and it had more rear space than the bulbous looking Mercedes A-Class. They were very aerodynamic with a CD of between 0.25 and 0.28, whereas normal super minis of that time struggled to get into the mid-3s. There was a range of A2s with different engines, both petrols and diesels, but this one, the 1.2 Tdi, is the mythical 100 mpg car. Let me show you what's so clever about them. The bonnet is very unconventional because it doesn't flip open like a normal one. There's actually 2 catches here, and you have to push it forward a little bit, and the whole thing comes out. Now, there's a really good reason for this. It means they don't need to use hinges, and then you don't just save the weight of the hinges, it also means that because the bonnet is just sitting on a platform, they can make it lighter. It doesn't have to have strengthening ribs and so on. But I hear you ask, what happens if you just need to top up the windscreen wash or the oil? Well, they thought of that because this little flap opens where you would normally have a conventional lever to open the bonnet inside. Once there's a little tray here for the windscreen wash. This is for your oil top up, and that's the dipstick to check the level. The standard cars with the all aluminium construction, the great aero, were clever enough. So the normal 1.4 diesel could easily hit 75 miles to the gallon. But this, also known as the 3-litre car, went much further than that. So it had thinner glass to make it lighter, magnesium wheels, lightened interior seats, the 1.2 engine, which I think only weighs about 100 kilos. It's lowered with lightened aluminium suspension, a different spoiler, and even the wheel arches come much further in for better aerodynamics. Despite all this, they only managed to produce 176,000, as opposed to almost 1 million of the horrid Mercedes A-Class. Well, maybe then, it's just not very good to drive. So first of all, for the run through the gears, I am going to do it with this 1.2. We want the full 61 horsepower. So for that, you want to hit the Eco button. Normally, I think this runs with about 50 horsepower, this 3-cylinder turbo diesel. But like this, it's going to have the full oomph, and apparently it makes a difference. So I've pressed the Eco button, but I can't see anything on the screen. Well, anyway, let's assume that it's good to go. Foot to the floor. You know what? It's not as slow as you would think with 60 horsepower. Then again, it's only 900 kilos, so that really helps. Now, as standard, these cars, the 1.2, came with this sort of robotized Tiptronic Typesym, which has 5 gears. Now, the gear changes themselves are pretty horrible. I mean, you put your foot down as well, there's such a long delay between it kicking down and it transferring the power back to the wheels. And in the same way, when it changes gear, it almost feels like there's a second delay between one gear change and the other. But the engine itself is actually quite lovable and willing. At slower speeds, sorry, not at slower speeds, when you start it up and you're just maneuvering, it sounds quite clattery and quite rough. But when you drive normally, it's got quite a nice little grumble to it, around 3,000 to 4,000 revs. It's quite torquey. It's just that gearbox that gets in the way, which is also another weak point of the car in another way. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The cabin, by modern standards, it looks a little bit basic, but you have to compare it to what was around at the time. Standard equipment was pretty poor on this, but Erling, who owns it, has done a few little upgrades. I mean, the owners of these cars, the 1.2s, they're always enthusiasts, and he has changed to slightly later multi-function wheel, which lifts the ambience a little bit, but I like the utilitarian nature of it. They just didn't come with a lot of standard equipment, but what is there is solid, it's well put together. And as usual with VW products at this time, it all makes sense ergonomically as well. You can get really comfortable in these. Now, this particular A2, you will notice, has definite signs of wear. There's little bits missing off the side there, there's a bit of staining, but then you look down and you see that it has 215,000 miles on it, which is absolutely astonishing. Erling told me that his aim is to get at least 500,000 on it. One of the things that I find most bizarre, and I think this is down to the gearbox, is that when you put your foot down, it almost slows down initially. I think what happens is, because it takes drive away from the engine to try and kick down on the gearbox, so it almost feels like the car is losing pace for a fraction of a second before the engine kicks in and pushes it. That's something I really do not like. It's not just a hesitation, it actually feels like the car is slowing down. The driving experience is more fun than you would give it credit for. The steering is sharp, light, direct, it's quite accurate. Again though, put your foot down and it just hesitates so much, but go down the road and it is nice. The ride I find a little bit brittle, but also Erling told me it is now running sort of full winter tyres, and that takes away a little bit of the feel and quite a lot of the grip. So although I grumbled a little bit about the ride, you have to be aware that apparently it is better, with different tyres, but also on the normal cooking versions, because this is lowered down for better aero. 0.25 it has, which is very impressive, but that means there's less travel and you can feel it on the bigger bumps. You can feel it hitting the bump stops. We're going to take it up through the gears again, and then I'm going to try and monster it through the tighter bends and see how it reacts. Okay, foot to the floor from nothing. Those gear changes are simply comical. It's the slowest gearbox that I have ever used. The engine is really quite likeable, but that gearbox is horrendous. I think you have to make smooth progress, or you have to maybe try and keep it stuck in the gears if you want to get anywhere. But anyway, let's throw it in. A little bit of understeer present. That gearbox, I hate it. Well, for those of you that thought it would be crap to drive, I hate to disappoint you. This thing is a riot. You can really fling it down the road. I think the downside of that is the suspension has very little travel, so on bigger bumps you can feel that it grounds out. But it's great fun. It really makes me wonder just how good it would be with a set of all year round tyres rather than the winters, and if you had the manual gearbox. So say a 1.4, another 10 horsepower manual gearbox, this would really be brilliant. I mean, it is great as it is. They have a good reputation for reliability, and running costs are generally low. That fuel consumption is amazing. So the 75 mpg for the normal cars, the 1.4 diesels, is really easy to achieve, and on these you can get close to 100 miles to the gallon. The one weakness with this car when it comes to reliability is once again that gearbox. They are troublesome, they do go wrong a lot, but otherwise they're pretty good. Of course, rust isn't an issue, so that's another plus. Now, there's no modern Super Mini quite like this. I think none of them are notable for having small dimensions externally, but huge interior space, being well built and also efficient. It is notable that lots of Super Minis have grown in height. So the outline of this, you might think maybe that's had an impact, but it absolutely hasn't. The reason why they've all grown in height is because we now want cars that are physically taller on their suspension, i.e. SUV type stuff and crossovers. So ironically, although this was a car that should have reshaped the future of transport, it's not this which has had a big impact, but rather it's another car which I abhor. So the Nissan Juke, which came out roughly at the same time or slightly after, was nothing more than just a raised platform, and yet has had a massive effect on the future of cars. Why is it that this, which has so much going for it, failed so spectacularly to have an impact on what we drive now? Now, there are two, maybe three main problems that the A2 encountered. I think the first is that the aluminium chassis is a great asset, but it's also a problem. When it comes to repairs, for example, it is way more expensive if you have a big crash to repair this than it would be in its steel counterpart. That also means that you're more likely to end up writing off the car. And again, because of the chassis, these were very expensive when they were new. At the same time, BMW had the 1 Series and the Compact, which weren't really that much more money, but had more of a feel of prestige about them, I suppose, because I think if you're an engineer or if you appreciate different cars, then you will love the A2, like I do. Although I love sports cars or so on, I really do appreciate the engineering that went behind this. But if what you want is a smaller car that feels like a bigger car and has the prestige associated with the badge, this failed a little bit. The looks are cute, but you don't necessarily want cute in a car like this. And then, of course, to compound it all, because it was so much aimed at efficiency, there was no halo versions. Actually, the 100 mpg car was the halo version in a way, whereas the small BMWs had the bigger engine options that help lift the way the whole range felt. There is an upside though. Now you can buy one of these very special cars for not very much money. So the range for the different options, they start at about £1,500 to £4,000 for a fairly decent car. Now the 1.2s were never sold in the UK, and if you look at the classifieds right now, they're mainly populated by 1.4 petrol, which is 4-cylinder, or the 3-cylinder 1.4, which has, I think maybe, is it 75 horsepower rather than 61? To be honest, this really doesn't feel slow. Power is not its problem, but having a different gearbox would help. But anyway, those are there. There are some imports from Europe, and occasionally 1.2s do pop out. So if you have to have one of these more specialized cars, you'll have to look a little bit harder, and I think maybe they might be a little bit more expensive as well. Well, if you do end up getting one, the great thing is that there is a brilliant owners club called the A2 OC, and they have, they're a friendly bunch, and They give you lots of support and information and so on the cars. The link is just there. The MPG that this manages to achieve really begs a question. If you look at a Ford Mach-E, in terms of kilowatt hour, which is the efficiency for electric cars, it hits about 102 MPG equivalent. The Teslas do better. I think that some of them, not the X, but the Model 3, for example, will do the equivalent of 130 MPG. But 25 years earlier, this small car with a combustion engine was able to get 100 miles to the gallon. Now I'm just wondering, 25 years later, if Audi had another attempt at making a car like this, would they actually be able to make something which was even more efficient maybe than an electric car? So an interesting thought for us to end on there. Thank you so much to Erling for bringing it down, and thank you to you guys for watching.